Hello, Daniel. Good to have you.
Yes, hi. Great to see you.
Let's jump right in. How's your mood in Cambridge these days? What's it like?
Yeah, yeah, a little schizophrenic, I would say, in the sense that, you waver between um, looking, the street that I live on is very quiet, but you watch the news and it seems like we're on the verge of civil war. So it's hard to make sense of the macro situation and like kind of my own micro experience on a daily basis. But very, I guess, um, nervous, but also hopeful. I guess is how I would describe it.
Well, the micro is one part. That the macro is another part. You're um, well known for being in the macro, very an expert in the macro. The book that you published in 2018 was called "How Democracies Die," and you explain specifically the mechanics of political decay, with specific emphasis on what some would call American fascism under Trump. We don't need to go into that discussion, but we might. I'm more interested actually in, as we are at the New Institute in general, sort of how we can learn from what we've experienced. So is there anything in the last 4 years that is constructive, positive, something to build on, to build on for change?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to say is, yeah, so we wrote this book in 2017, 18, and because we were so worried and so alarmed about all of the signs of the potential abuses of Donald Trump as he came into office. And I think in some ways, some people thought we were overly alarmist. I think in retrospect, perhaps we weren't alarmist enough. I mean, I think Trump has been much more destructive than I think we imagined. And that's partly because the Republican Party, I think, has really abdicated and not stood up to him. So, but you asked about hopeful signs. So
Yes,
all of that,
if that's possible.
I'm worried about all of that. And I think there actually are. So I think something that a positive development has, it's, I mean, I think in some ways it's become manifest, but it's the kind of end of a long process of development, which is the movement I think that was most visible that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement and the response to the murder of George Floyd earlier this year, and that the degree to which you had this mass mobilization of citizens in response to that, and I think critically the degree to which white Americans have become much more liberal and inclusive and egalitarian on racial questions. And so there was this way in which I think Donald Trump thought he could replay Richard Nixon's kind of silent majority strategy of 1968. And in the face of Black Americans in the streets, he thought he could kind of mobilize white Americans in this divisive way. But the U.S. has changed, I think, since 1968. And surveys have shown this. I mean, there's been people, political scientists and survey research looking at this, and it's pretty clear that white Americans, majorities of white Americans now think that African Americans are mistreated in the United States, that racism is a real problem, that more needs to be done to address this. And I think part of this is a reaction to Donald Trump, in fact, because one also sees similar attitudes, more inclusive, liberal attitudes on immigration. I think more Americans today think that immigration is a net positive to the United States than they did in 2016. So in a way, Trump has generated a counter reaction. And so I think it's pretty clear that a majority of Americans are actually liberal-minded Democrats. The problem is that they are not in control of the government. So, and this is not just something that's been caused by Trump. It's the result of generation of change, but it's really accelerated, I think, under Trump. So that's one hopeful development.
There are other movements actually that play a role in American politics in a new way, I guess. Of Sunrise Movement, for example, is another one. So is there something that's going beyond the I wouldn't say topical, but sort of the issue, so Black Lives Matter being all encompassing in a way, and climate movement like Sunrise Movement also all encompassing. But is it changing the political dynamic or the fabric of democracy in your view?
Well, yeah, I do think. I mean, I think the most salient issue right now is partly is race. I mean, somehow I think, unfortunately, like climate change issues have taken something of a backseat given the existential nature threat to our democracy. And this I think does raise an interesting question of, where do policy debates and where do kind of debates over the political process, these aren't necessarily the same. But I do think that a point that I've been making since 2016, that there's never been a majority of Americans who support Donald Trump. I mean, he didn't win the majority of the vote. He's never had more than 40-something% of support. And some people may, I think, are shocked by the fact that he still has 40% of the vote and think, well, how can this person still have 40% of the vote, and what does this say about American politics? But I think I flip it around and say a majority of Americans have never liked this. And so there are all of these strands generate. I think so. So what you're pointing to, I think, is partly. I mean, I think there's these kind of movements around Black Lives Matters, but there's also lots of other social movements developing, and I think there's a generational change. I mean, it's very clear that younger Americans are very skeptical of the kind of politics and policies that he represents. And so I think there is the potential for a transformation in our politics. I'm not naive enough to think like we've sort of entered the promised land and everything will now happen smoothly, if Joe Biden wins the election. But I think there are the elements there, at least, for a strong opposition to the kind of politics we're seeing. And I guess the point to make about that is that this is very much in contrast to other places where democracy has been threatened. I mean, so if you think of the US as being a place where democracy has been threatened, I mean, if you compare this to, let's say, Hungary or Turkey, places where the opposition, I mean, one of the reasons that Viktor Orban has been able to do what he's done, or Erdogan, is that the opposition has been very weak, and at least and actually less weak and more fractured. And I think one thing that makes the U.S. different than these places is that the opposition has been actually remarkably robust and relatively united. I mean, there's always internal fissures, and those will erupt again, I think, soon. But at the moment, this has been a kind of pretty united front, focused on the sense that this, the first thing that has to happen is the election has to kind of change power. And so that's I think been a positive development.
One of the things that I guess became clear in the last 4 years, but also sort of something that you allude to in your book, is the two democracies somehow. So there's the architecture, the system, the functioning of democracy with its institutions, and some of them fail, old. It's a stress test that's in front of us with the Constitution, with the Supreme Court somehow in a critical role. But that's one democracy. And the other democracy that you point out is very, very important. I think that has become evident also in Europe in the last couple of years, is what you call norms, is sort of lived democracy, is the fragile construction of citizens having to agree actually on what is abstract in a concrete way. And that you describe as a breakdown in the book, but it's also, as any breakdown, can also somehow serve as the point of reconstruction in some way. Is there, I mean, you alluded to some of that, but maybe we can explore that a little further. So if you say the younger generation, or so certain values about sustainability or responsibility, is there a new somehow system of norms? Is there a rebuilding of norms that you see as possible? Or
yeah, I guess, I mean, maybe I'm less hopeful in a sense, because I do think that I mean, there's in every political system and in every social interaction, there's always unwritten rules guiding behavior, and so that's what we describe as norms. And that the two that we identified as being most important for democracy's successful functioning is this notion of mutual toleration, where you accept your opponents as rivals, not as enemies. And the second is the kind of use of forbearance or self-restraint, and the unwillingness or the intentional underuse of power that you might have in a particular office, because often political offices are very powerful and you actually have to use self-restraint, because if everybody plays to the max, then you get kind of chaos. So, but I think the point that we made was that in order for these two norms to endure, polarization has to be kind of low, because if polarization is very high and you regard and you're fearful of the other side, then of course, why would you show self-restraint, or why would you regard the others as just rivals and not enemies? And so this underlying dynamic of polarization is still very present in the U.S. And so, I mean, you've begun to see in the United States, I think, I mean, this is a long process that, of kind of decline of this mutual toleration that, you know, I tend to think started on the Republican side. I mean, historians can debate this, but I think that's the evidence is pretty clear. But, you know, the example of this having really fallen apart in recent years is, or in recent days, is over the Supreme Court nomination, where, you know, so in 2016, where President Obama wanted to have his appointee and the Senate Republicans refused to even hold hearings, and then now subsequently, so leaving a spot open, allowing Donald Trump to appoint 2 judges, which is, you know, he has every constitutional right to do. But then right now, right before the election, doing exactly what the Republicans now nominating somebody, you know, a weeks before the election, doing exactly what they had previously said was not acceptable. And so what you see is this kind of really hard knuckle, hardball politics around this. And so again, it's, you know, it points to is that the process of selecting judges, just to take this example, is broken in the United States. And the reason it's broken is that it's not working as it's supposed to. And the reason it's not working as it's supposed to is because this norm of self-restraint has fallen away. And so the question then becomes, and it's a very active debate. I mean, you open the newspapers today, and this is what everybody's debating is, well, what should be done about this? Because now, you know, it's starting in January, you may have a 6-3 conservative majority, which no matter what your political views are, you know, that's kind of a lopsided thing, you know, in a way. This is supposed to be somewhat even, I think, is the sort of normal expectation. But, you know, leaving that aside, you know, what should be done? And so the increasingly, understandably, Democrats think, well, you know, if Republicans are going to do this, we need to do this. And, you know, if they're going to play hardball, we're going to play hardball. So if President Biden comes into office and we have a Democratic majority, we should, since the U.S. Constitution doesn't specify the number of judges, we should, you know, propose 3 judges and even things up, or, you know, or whatever the number is. And so this is the kind of debate around court packing. The way I kind of think about this, and this is getting to the more general point, I think, that you're asking about norms, or what to do when norms are decaying, because I think it's hard to, on the one hand, I think it's sort of really a dumb thing to do for Democrats to just continue to abide by this norm that is broken. I mean, it's like really fighting a fight with one hand tied behind your back. If the other side's not following the norm, why would you continue to do it? That means the norm is broken and dead. On the other hand, I think that the alternative response that's often offered is, well, we need to punish Republicans and show them that this is retribution, show them that this is a mistake, and pack the Supreme Court. I also think that rather than kind of creating a new norm, as you're describing, this is just a kind of escalation and a fight. So what my kind of proposed or favored the way of thinking about what to do when a norm is down is to, so, I mean, if we think of these as the soft guardrails, norms as soft guardrails, as we describe them, when the soft guardrails break, then it's time to build hard guardrails and pass laws, pass maybe constitutional changes to reconfigure this whole process. And so I think one way of dealing, because it's hard to build from scratch overnight when you're facing a kind of acute situation like this. So I think when norms break down, what needs to happen is hard rules, laws, institutions need to be used to substitute for them. And so I think, for instance, one thing that could be done is a kind of whole set of reforms considered, like passing of age retirement limits, or term limits, or changing the size of the court, or keeping it the same but formalizing it. And actually, just, I know this is a long answer to your question, but just as an example of where this has happened in the past in the U.S., so when Franklin Roosevelt, you know, previously there was no term limits on it. President could be president for life, but the norm was you serve 2 terms. President Roosevelt broke this norm and served for 4 terms. And so the response to this back in the late 40s, early 50s was not to try to construct a new norm, or it was not to continue to abide by the dead norm. It was not to play hardball and then seek 4 terms for the next Republican president. Instead, what happened is Republicans proposed and Democrats agreed to a constitutional amendment to impose a term limit. So I think it's kind of similar thing maybe should happen now. So again, the short answer is when norms begin to break down, it shows the weakness of our and fragility of our system. We need to kind of formalize these things, and the U.S. is particularly vulnerable to this because we have such a short constitution and so on. And over time norms do develop, but I think we're facing a situation where we can't sort of wait around for the norms to develop, to re-emerge by themselves.
Well, you have a short constitution, but it's the oldest democracy in some way, and I think the history of the historicity of it has become also clear in recent. What was the 400th anniversary, basically, of enslavement of blacks in the U.S. And you point to that in your book, and I think it's very, very interesting, as always, to look backwards and to look ahead. So you say something that is still stark in a way, to sort of demystify the American democracy, sort of this the image of America itself. You say that America's democratic norms were born in the context of exclusion, or you can also say, maybe more so, American democracy is built on exclusion, and sort of connecting that, you also mentioned you quote Daniel Allen, the Harvard political philosopher, as describing as the challenge of, I guess, the present or the future is to build a multi-ethnic democracy where no particular ethnic group is in the majority. And in some ways, I guess that is, as Ta-Nehisi Coates pointed out, Trump is the first white president. So in some ways, this seems to be what's playing out at the moment. So a fundamental struggle about the history and the future of American democracy. How do you see that? How do you view the elements of how do you see the challenge of a multi-ethnic democracy, just plain and simple?
Yeah, no, and this is obviously a challenge that it's not only confronting the United States, but Germany and European societies as well. But it's particularly acute in the U.S. because, so I think these are variations on a theme. What as countries, as France is dealing with the situation that just happened this week in Paris, and I mean the kind of demographic shifts that take place in advanced societies are inevitably cause, or maybe not inevitably, but they do cause political turmoil. But the U.S., I think, is this problem is more acute because because slavery is very much still, the legacy of slavery is very much present. I mean, it's not very long ago. We were talking multiple, generations of people whose ancestors were slaves. And so that's one thing. But then secondly, and this is a real difference between the U.S., I think, in European societies in dealing with these issues, that this kind of a real authoritarian hierarchical legacy is built into our political institutions. So if you think of Germany as a new constitution after 1948, France has a new constitution, essentially, so I mean, and so that is not directly linked to its murderous authoritarian past, the Nazi past, or France with its colonial past. So immediately in the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution there's a wonderful book by David Waldstreicher called The Slave Constitution, and he basically argues that the U.S. Constitution, I mean, it's an amazing document because it never mentions the word slavery, but he identifies at least, I think it's 7 different sort of statements, or not articles, but clauses in the Constitution that in some way or another are protecting the interests of slaves. And those articles those clauses are still in the U.S. Constitution. So we're very much living with a document that was created in part by slaveholders to protect slavery's interests. And so the fact that we have a Senate with 2 representatives from each state is partly the way that the Electoral College is set up, and the way our presidents select are in some ways an outgrowth of that legacy. So it's harder to run away from that past. And I think and the value of this project the New York Times did over the last year, the 1619 project, is to kind of highlight this for mass consumption. So we have this issue with confronting our society, and how do we cope with it? And I think one of the that's why I mentioned at the beginning this Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, I think one of the things that's promising is that there seems to be a growing majority of Americans who recognize this past and who are a kind of multiracial democratic majority, I think, exists. And so I think the way to move forward is really to allow the majority to rule in the United States and the majority to govern. Because I think one of the things that's the real vulnerability of our system is that because of this old constitution and sort of an accident of history, Democrats seem to be, so the Constitution overrepresents rural areas. Our rural areas are overrepresented in the U.S. Constitution because you have 2 senators from each state. So unlike the Bundesrat, somewhat more proportional. Underpopulated areas are overrepresented. They're overrepresented in the college, so in the selection of the president. So because these two, the Senate and the presidency, pick the court, the Supreme Court also overrepresents these areas. And so presently it's now possible in the United States and actually exists that, and because Republicans, just as a result of history and sort of unintended way, are overrepresented in those rural areas, we now have a system in which Republicans are able to win the presidency, win the Senate and the Supreme Court without winning a majority of the vote. And so we have, in effect, what you can think of as minority rule. And so, no president, only one president only one Republican president in the last 20 years has won a majority of the vote. That was George Bush in 2004. Yet Republicans have controlled the presidency 12 of the last 20 years. Republicans have a majority of seats in the U.S. Senate, although they don't have a majority of the votes for the U.S. Senate. And so as a result, then the court also reflects this. Now, why this is all relevant for your question about the multiracial democracy is that at present, the Republican Party is 90%, its voting base is white, 90% white. So you have, the potential, and I think we're living with this right now, where a white minority controls the political system without winning a majority. And I think, the Democratic Party is a multi-ethnic party. And I think if we, in some ways, can allow the majority to win elections and to then govern, that this will allow for a multi-ethnic society to thrive, a multi-ethnic democracy. And so one of the things that I'm really a big advocate of is, potentially adding states to the U.S. Senate, maybe abolishing the Electoral College to kind of undo this weird overrepresentation of minority areas. And I think, and then finally allowing, really doubling down on expanding the right to vote and protecting the right to vote, because I really, firmly believe that Americans are liberal minded, and the more people who vote, the more the majority speaks, the more inclusive our democracy is. And I think this would be a way of addressing this legacy that Danielle Allen talks about, and that although the U.S. right now is democracy is, from around the world is regarded as really fundamentally flawed, I think there is the potential, if these kinds of reforms were introduced, that it could be a model for how to govern a multi-ethnic democracy. And so, that's sort of the more hopeful kind of perspective that I bring to these issues.
No, it's super interesting. I think that's also sort of why so much of the world, for a lot of reasons, is fascinated with American democracy. It's like the petri dish in some way of how democracy might work, or how it came about, also in a petri dish. And the thing that you say somehow, I mean, which might sound shocking to the naive mind, so that the minority rules is basically, as you say, built in for a lot of reasons, and some reasons might be considered even valid today. I mean, that's an ongoing discussion about the representative democracy. So what are the gatekeepers, as you say in your book, to protect democracy? The question is, from whom? Sometimes it seems that Alexander Hamilton, I think, made that point, from the people. So that's even today. What?
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, in response to that, I mean, because, one might say, oh, well, we can't just have majority rule. We need some checks to protect the rights of minorities. And I totally agree with that. I mean, liberal democracy is also about protecting the rights of minorities. But, we have judicial review, we have the Bill of Rights, we have federalism. We already have all of these checks, so it's true that democracy is more than majority rule. That's absolutely right. But on the other hand, without majority rule, there is no democracy. So we at least need some kind of role for majorities to govern. At present, we're kind of verging on in a direction where that's maybe not the case.
Yeah, that's a bit where I would be heading with this question. So if you say gatekeeping has failed, and your Cambridge UK colleague David Runciman makes that point very clearly, that democracy is built for him historically on fear of, in his words, the young, the poor, the uneducated. So that was how in Athens democracy was conceived. In some way, you could still make the point that this is how it's constructed to make it really difficult for the majority to rule directly. And then you can also have that fear of the majority somehow implemented in a narration of democracy, and it's very powerful. And fascism and other movements, of course, could tell you, well, there is a potential of the danger of the majority, even though even though in Germany, actually, not to sort of exculpate Germany, but it was 43%. So it wasn't the majority actually that won the election. So I'm just curious, if like the electoral college and all these historic forms of gatekeeping have failed, is there, and that goes back to the movement, is there somehow another form of control and gatekeeping and the popular gatekeeping towards institutions? Do you see something like that somehow? And that connects also to the digital, for example, like other forms of participation or other forms of intervention in the political process that could be more institutionalized. Are you aware of changes in that direction? Do you foresee that? Do you want that? Do you warn against that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so when we talk about gatekeeping in our book, we mostly talked about the role of political parties as gatekeepers and the selection of the kinds of candidates who run for office. And that this is a kind of important role for political parties, that they select their own candidates who then run, stand then in front of the public and run for office. And so I think it's important for political parties to continue to play that role. And so that's, I'm an advocate of strong parties, because I think that that's an important mechanism that parties play, as a kind of filtration system. So before the candidate stands before the public seeking office, they've gone through some vetting process within a party. So that's fine. But I understand that that's like very old fashioned in some way, because there's a lot of people who think, well, parties are declining. What role can like the German Social Democrats play? Winning a kind of primary process. What kind of candidates emerge out of this process? Or you could similarly say the same thing about the American parties. If we end up with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, two 78-year-old men running against each other, you sort of wonder, is this really the best system for selecting our candidates if these are the people we end up with? Although I think Joe Biden is a pretty good candidate. I also and a very talented politician, actually. I can imagine younger people in particular, making this point. So where is gatekeeping where can it take place? So I do think parties matter. I do think that, I guess the broader point is I'm less fearful of majorities than I may have been than in the past. And I don't know if that's partly because of these new developments, I think, in public opinion in the U.S. I remember having a conversation or overhearing a German politician at some point say, well, we need to make sure we don't have overly high voter turnout in Eastern Germany, because, this will mean more votes for the AfD. And I remember being totally shocked by this, because essentially what that demonstrates is a complete lack of faith in voters. And I can understand why somebody might say that, like higher voter turnout seems to benefit, and I think similarly, you mentioned the example of, Weimar Germany, and, the increase in vote share to the Nazis in 1930, 1932 is a lot of people have kind of linked to higher voter turnout, these were previous non-voters who turned out to vote. And so the question is, if you have too much mobilization, isn't this dangerous? And I guess I continue to think or increasingly think that that's an overstated threat, and overstate that essentially there's wisdom in the majorities. And I do think, on the other hand, that there are a role for gatekeepers, I can think, in the realm of media, in the realm of science, in the realm of social science, and that what's pretty clear is that, and the question then becomes, who are the gatekeepers? Because you might just, the decline, and I guess I have thought through this less, so my thoughts are less well developed. But with the Can you not hear me? I'm sorry.
No, I hear you. No, it's all good.
Okay, because I think my headphones might be dying or something. So the with the decline of the traditional media outlets of the main networks and television in the United States or in Germany, and the kind of classic newspapers, and the rise of social media, in effect, what you're seeing is the decline of the gatekeepers in this realm, and it's a kind of democratization of the process, one might say, because now anybody can express anything they want and everybody can see it. And this does seem to open the way for demagogues, misinformation, conspiracy theories. And I guess I don't know what the answers to that question, what that dilemma are, because in principle, like, more voices is good. Yet it seems as if this also opens the door for more misinformation, more conspiracy theories, more, as we say in English, quack scientists, people who are just making stuff up. I guess I don't have a real good answer for that. I have the feeling that that's the kind of cutting edge issue that we should be thinking about, though, because, it's clearly some kinds of new regulations are necessary. I mean, one thought, I guess the one thought I would have is that in the same way that the television era in the United States and news broadcasting was regulated, there was like a fairness doctrine in which every media outlet had to present both sides of stories, which was eliminated. We need a new kind of regulatory structure that both respects freedom of expression and so on, but on the other hand, sets certain kind of parameters for what kind of speech is beyond the pale. And I think what's happening now is like Facebook and Twitter are themselves deciding this, and that's fine. But that's good that they're doing that. But I think so Facebook recently decided that any Holocaust denial kind of messages have to be removed from Facebook, and so which is a kind of big step for Facebook to do. But I think that if we're just relying on these big companies to regulate it, then we're letting them be the gatekeepers. So I guess the question is less whether or not there are gatekeepers, and because there's always gatekeepers. Even in a free flow marketplace of ideas, there's gatekeepers, just that it's private companies that are gatekeepers. And so I think there's less democratic accountability in that system than in one in which regulations designed by democratically elected politicians and democratically accountable bureaucracies are better gatekeepers. So maybe that's the way to think about it, is that there's always gatekeepers. It's just, are you going to have unaccountable gatekeepers or accountable gatekeepers? And what the very nature of regulation is that it's democratically accountable gatekeepers. And so I think that's the kind of area in which there should be development.
Yeah, that's I guess the big issue for the future, looking ahead. And even though our time is limited, I would still ask in that direction one or two questions, because I think it is so relevant. You raised the point of digital democracy in some way, in its ambivalences, in its liberating, emancipatory potential that's there, and in its highly problematic, demagogic, and also manipulatory way, and Facebook being in the middle of it in a very problematic way, I guess. Judging today one way, the other day another way. There was the news story about Mother Jones, a liberal publication, or other liberal publications having been massively downgraded by the algorithm for a considerable period of time. And then a very somehow impromptu decision to downgrade one story in the New York Post the other day, which was more for the liberal side. So it's quite, as you say, unaccountable is a very polite word for that. It's really
arbitrary.
Arbitrary. It's in some way Wild West, I guess. We're in a new territory, to say it, I guess, right. Objectively or neutrally. So I would be interested in these three big factors that shape, how democracies die. You could also sort of think about, and those aren't mentioned for plausible reasons in your book because they weren't so prevalent in some way, but maybe they were actually prevalent and you didn't pick up on them for good reasons as well. So I would say digital, unhinged capitalism, and climate crisis. So those are three potential threats, I think, to democracy that I see. Again, how could you both? Do you see are these like pain points to also save democracy, to change democracy? Because we can't go back to the old, I guess. So you can't undo digitalism. You can't deny injustice. without sort of sacrificing democracy, I think. And you can't. And this is really a challenge: how to react to climate change in the mechanisms of decision making in the democratic process. How do you see that?
Yeah. So that's a great list of challenges, and I think the interesting is the unhinged capitalism and social media. In some ways, I think is especially unhinged capitalism are not new phenomena. I mean, these are very old phenomena. Even social media, although the particular technological form is new. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that media has always been disruptive. Media developments, going back to newspapers, the print. So it's always been disruptive. I mean, it's clearly more disruptive. It's accelerating. But these are old dilemmas in a way of democracy, of how to balance free speech. And so, with regards to social media, free speech and kind of misinformation. I mean, in some ways, this is an old dilemma. Unhinged capitalism and democracy, this is an old dilemma. Not to say that it's not more pressing, it feeling particularly pressing now, but the kind of balancing of economic inequality produced by capitalism and political equality promised by democracy, how to balance these things. And that unhinged capitalism can be disruptive of democracy by giving some people more voice than others because of more money, as well as trying to manage the instabilities and disruptions caused by capitalism within a democratic setting. So, and I think, interestingly, I think especially on that second one of unhinged capitalism, there's been incredible progress, actually. I mean, if you think back to the Great Depression and the response to my daughter was just asking me this morning, what happens if a bank runs out of money? Do you still lose your money? And saying, well, there's this great thing invented of required insurance for banks. We've actually learned how to cope with economic disruptions, our understanding of how the economy works and what economic policies and how to adjust interest rates and spending to manage the economy. This is like, in some ways, one of the most hopeful signs in our macro lives is the degree to which we're able to deal with these economic instabilities. Not to say that everything's working smoothly and beautifully, but there has been actual progress. This is like an area where there's actually been progress in the world. And so I think what that also gives me hope for is in these other areas that's possible. So, and again, also with media as well. I think this is maybe less. There's been less progress, and we're really behind the curve, I think, on this. Now, I would separate those two issues then away from climate change, because I mean, maybe environmental historians would probably disagree or could tell me if this is right or not. But that might be somebody that's interesting to bring this kind of view into the debate, which is, to what degree is this an unprecedented crisis? I mean, the climate crisis maybe is an unprecedented crisis, and the scale of it and the rapidity in place. And so I think this represents, of those three that you just mentioned, the most difficult to deal with, because there's the sense in which the time frame of democracy is democracy's slow moving process. Incremental improvement, and that's what's that's the virtue of democracy. In fact, on the other hand, the climate crisis is a fast-moving problem, and it's an emergency. And so the question is, how do we respond to that climate crisis in a way that can a democracy cope with this? And I continue to think it is possible, but that's a risky bet. Because if wrong, then we're in trouble. So, but I get so that on that last third point, I think that's the most challenging of all, and I'm not sure kind of what the answer is.
So we need to work on that for the future of democracy.
I think so. I think so. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So maybe to finish. In a way, is there? I mean, if this is the end of American exceptionalism that we see, is there anything good about that? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, so I've spent my career. I'm a scholar of comparative politics. So I've spent my whole career thinking about the U.S. in comparative perspective, and so. I mean, I think it was Barack Obama who at one point got in trouble when he was asked about American exceptionalism. I mean, as a politician, you're not supposed to say this. An American politician, he said, well, all countries think they're exceptional. There's the Sonderweg, whatever. Every country has its own exceptionalisms. And I think the U.S., has these, unique features to it, the importance of immigration, the size of the landmass, the newness of the country, the age of the Constitution, that all of these things, the absence of a feudal legacy, all of these things that make the U.S. Different. But in confronting these kinds of problems like social media, unhinged capitalism, climate crisis, the U.S. is very much part of facing the same sets of challenges. And I think the kind of rise of the kind of demographics and the threat of demagogues is something that all countries face. And so, I'm interested. I continue to be interested in how Europe deals with these problems and how the U.S. deals with them. And I do think that I hope. I guess this goes back to that Danielle Allen question. This is then where my sentimental American side comes out. I sort of think, well, the U.S. maybe could be a country that figures out how to deal with this multi-ethnic challenge in a way that could be a model for other countries. So, who knows if that's right, but I think there is, there is a legacy and history of dealing with new populations. There's some positive lessons, and I'm hoping that we can kind of emerge out of this period with some more lessons.
On that hopeful note, one last question:
yes.
Who will take the oath on January 21st? Not on January 21st, but in January 21.
Yes. Well, if I had to,
I'm not who won the election.
I think
so. Just who will take the oath?
Oh, who will take? Yeah. I'm hoping the same person who won the election. That's the one who won the election. That's my prediction. But
no.
I hope. Right.
Trump or Biden? Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Biden seems to be winning according to all the polls, but we'll see. Everybody's been facing this trauma of 2016, where they were convinced that Hillary Clinton would win, and the polls all suggested that, and it didn't turn out that way. So I think everybody's quite nervous about this. But if I did have to bet, I would say that Joe Biden will win.
Okay, well then we can come January we can work on solving all these problems that we talked about.
Yes, right. Exactly.
Okay, well thank you, Daniel, for
okay, good. Okay, thank you.
And good luck for the next step.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.